begin by offering my personal thanks to the conference organizers, to our moderator, Dr. Wadeen, and specifically to my friend Joel Belkamp, who helped with the logistics that make my presence here with you possible. I'm going to speak about the Christians of Syria, and I don't have visuals, but what my colleague Fabrice put up was very helpful and excellent. Syria's Christians are arguably the most vulnerable community in that tortured country, yet they remain the least talked about. When considering the Syrian civil war that started in 2011, and before getting to the Syrian Christians, one's attention is monopolized, usually in this order, by big power rivalries, the Saudi-Iranian proxy war of Sunnis versus Shiites, the ambitions of neighboring Turkey, the terror threat associated with Islamic State's self-proclaimed caliphate, the sufferings of the Sunni majority at the hands of Bashar Assad's Ba'athist regime, and lastly, the plight of Syria's various indigenous minority communities, beginning with the ruling Alawites, followed by the Kurds, and at the very end, if any attention span is left, Christians. This persistent marginalization of the Christians and the pressures bearing down on them is not peculiar to Syria, but has marked the fortunes of native Middle Eastern Christians as a whole, dating back, in recent times at least, to the sustained regional and international neglect of Lebanon's beleaguered Christians throughout the years of war in that country between 1975 and 1990. There are some clear reasons for this persistent marginalizing of the plight of Syria's and the region's native Christians that deserve at least to be noted here. Contrary to a prevailing erroneous view among many in the Muslim East, Western secular governments do not define their interests along any recognizable Christian lines, nor do they see the Christians under duress elsewhere in the world as somehow being their suffering co-religionists, and therefore worthy as such of receiving priority in the form of direct protection and assistance with when facing impending dangers. The contrived and largely medieval narrative propagated by the likes of Al-Qaeda and Daesh, IS, Islamic State, ISIS, ISIL, it's all the same thing. The contrived, as I said, and largely medieval narrative propagated by the likes of Daesh and Al-Qaeda, that they are fighting a global war against crusaders and infidels, paints the secular political West in distorted religious strokes, thereby confusing the ill-informed and the superficial, and in most cases prompting the latently fanatical among the Muslim masses. If anything, and precisely in order to dispel this impression, Western governments bend over backwards to throw off any traces of the crusader stigma, leading many of them, and on more than one occasion, to actually ignore, if not work actively to undermine, the precarious position of Christian communities living in Muslim-majority settings. Add to all this the existence of an entrenched tendency within the leading secular governments of the West to cater to what they perceive as those states or entities or majorities with whom some of their vital material interests are seen to be connected. Energy-rich Islamic countries like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states topping such a list. Highlighting Christian persecution in and around any of these Islamic countries might risk upsetting relations with their rulers and possibly alienating their peoples. So such Christian and indeed human causes quickly recede to the background and become expendable for these Western governments. This is why the religious liberties lobby in both Congress and among some leading NGOs in Washington, for instance, has a consistently hard time cutting any ice with policymakers at the State Department or the White House in the hope of exercising a tangible impact on US foreign policy in places like the Middle East. Thus, a far from negligible streak of undeclared Christophobia, the mirror image of the much talked about Islamophobia, pervades official Western attitudes regarding maltreatment of Christians who are native to the Islamic world. And this in turn is reinforced by a secular media that has become overtly anti-Christian in many instances. The net result of all this, Christian agony in the Middle East, has become largely a non-issue. In Syria, as in Iraq, systematic destruction of churches along with wholesale massacres and dispossessions of rooted Christians have gone largely underreported over the past few years of turmoil in these two countries. Before proceeding any further, let me offer a glimpse of who these indigenous Christian communities are in Syria. This is necessary. Prior to the winter of 2011 and the outbreak of civil war, the native Christians of Syria numbered around 2.3 million of a total of roughly 23 million people, namely about 10% of the overall Syrian population. Although most of these Syrian Christians are ethnic Arabs, who are largely Greek Orthodox and some Greek or Melkite Catholics, a considerable number of them are ethnic Armenians that moved south from eastern Turkey after the genocidal massacres of 1915, and others are ethnic Assyrians, either of the Eastern Orthodox or Chaldean Catholic denominations. In addition, there are Syriac Orthodox and Syriac Catholics, as well as Maronite Catholics. Syria's Christian communities have tended to dwell mainly in and around the larger cities of Damascus, Aleppo, and Homs. Smaller concentrations can be found in Tartus, Latakia, Hama, Suwaida, Ma'lula, Kasab, Sadat, and other towns and cities, in particular in the region known as Wadi al-Nasara, or the Valley of the Nazareans, meaning Christians, stretching roughly from Homs northwest to Tartus. Since the outbreak of civil war in 2011, the numbers of Christians in Syria have fallen to around 1.9 million in 2012, 1.7 in 2013. Further reductions occurred in the next 2 years as well. Emigration, usually due to flight from approaching danger as well as to forced displacement, and also the traditional reasons for emigration in peaceful times, which is seeking better economic opportunities. Emigration roughly has been the principal reason for this sudden demographic decline. But also what my colleague from Greece mentioned, which is the lower birth rates, is also part of the picture as well. Historically, the prevailing narrative of Syria's Christians has been one of unrelenting subordination to second-class or dhimmi status under Sunni Muslim majority rule. This fact puts Syria's Christians in the same league, roughly, of subjugated groups as more than 90% of the region's native Christian communities, with the notable exception being Lebanese Christians, who managed over the centuries, usually at a considerable cost to themselves in terms of blood and treasure, to preserve a distinctive degree of free and dignified existence. The Christians in Syria cannot be viewed in isolation from the Christians of the region, in particular those to their east in Iraq and those to their west in Lebanon. In addition to sharing a history of dhimmitude with Iraqi Christians, the two Christian communities of Syria and Iraq have come under a vicious assault over the past few years with the rise of the Islamic State, Daesh. The Assyrian and Chaldean Christians of Iraq suffered terribly at the hands of ISIS, with whole villages being uprooted in the process. In many places in North Iraq, the Kurds moved in and took over the ruined homes of the fleeing or massacred Christians and Yazidis, thereby completing a process that can only be described as deliberate ethno-religious cleansing. This pattern continued in Syria as well, though with lesser intensity. Wherever ISIS or other milder Islamist groups belonging to the armed anti-regime Sunni opposition seized Christian or mixed villages, unleashing a series of persecutions and evictions that have drastically reduced Syrian Christian numbers across the country. Hardest hit in September of 2013 was the historic Syrian Christian town of Ma'lula, a World Heritage Site where Aramaic, the language from the days of Jesus, is still spoken and containing many ancient churches and monasteries that were ransacked and destroyed, with residents killed and clergy taken hostage. When it comes to mistreatment of Christians, there is little difference between ISIS and the Islamist paramilitaries like the Nusra Front, an Al-Qaeda affiliate, which struck at Ma'lula. I mean, I see all of these groups as sort of sitting on various points of a slippery slope, perhaps ISIS-Daesh being at the bottom of the slope. For these violent extremists and others like them, Christians must be reduced to tax-paying dhimmi status, or forced to convert, or made to abandon their ancestral homes, or risk being slaughtered. These are the choices. The Christians in Raqqa, the Syrian headquarters of ISIS, were forced in February 2014 to sign a document accepting dhimmi status and the imposed jizya tax, the poll tax, that comes with such humiliating subordination in return for not being expelled or killed by Daesh. The Lebanon that emerged in 1920 to the west of what is today Syria as a French sphere of influence, known as Greater Lebanon, Grand Liban, was one that incorporated predominantly Sunni Tripoli and Muslim parts of the north and the Bekaa Valley, and that purposely excluded the mainly Greek Orthodox string of villages in today's northwestern Syria, Wadi Nasara. Configured in this fashion, at that time, Greater Lebanon was largely due to Maronite insistence that they remain the majority Christian community in this emerging Lebanon, with little heed for taking on board substantial Muslim areas. It quickly proved, however, to be a short-sighted policy that would eventually backfire as Muslim demographics swelled. Robert de Kay, then a high-ranking French official in Lebanon, wrote perceptively that, and I quote, "Creating a too large Lebanon is a serious error. Greater Lebanon breeds an irredentism. We have made Lebanese many Muslims who do not want to be Lebanese," end quote. The Maronite refusal to include Syria's Greek Orthodox has shown itself over the long term to have been equally detrimental to sustaining a Christian majority. Despite this grave error on the part of Lebanon's Maronites, they did manage to preserve for several decades an impressive degree of freedom for their community and for the other Christians in the country, as well as for Muslims who joined Lebanon. The Lebanon War of 1975 to 1990 reduced the Christians from having been slightly over 50% during the middle decades of that century to somewhere in the neighborhood of 35%. Initially, after the outbreak of civil strife in 2011, the Christians of Syria were denounced in many quarters as regime supporters. The secular ruling Ba'ath parties in both Iraq and Syria, under Saddam Hussein and Hafiz Assad, had skillfully refrained from targeting the Christians as such, and on some occasions had actually included them in cabinets and relied on them to hold a few sensitive posts in the state apparatus. Eventually, however, the Syrian Ba'ath cynically exploited, and in some instances facilitated, Christian massacres by jihadi Islamists in order to whitewash their own blood-soaked record of repression and to promote themselves as the preferred secular alternative to the likes of Al-Qaeda and Daesh. The problem is that anything that stands next to Daesh starts to look good. And Assad has been very skillful in exploiting that to whitewash his own murderous image. Syria's Christians thus have endured a double tragedy, being unfairly accused of siding with the Assad regime and serving as targets of opportunity for both regime and Islamist terror. As Daesh, with its ghastly televised beheadings, rose to prominence in Syria and Russia entered the fray militarily to bolster its ally, Bashar Assad, while Western governments toned down their anti-regime rhetoric, the accusation directed at the Christians slowly began to recede. Now, let me just say a word here by way of historical reminder. You know, it was Syrian Greek Orthodox intellectuals who invented Arabism and Baathism. Michel Aflaq and Constantine Zurek, who later became a professor at the American University of Beirut and taught me, are really the theoreticians behind both Arabism and Baathism. And the reasons are clear. We can go into great detail on this, and I won't now because I don't have the time, but it is a dhimmi phenomenon. It reminds me very much of Karl Marx's solution for the Jewish question. The best way to eliminate the difference between Jews and Gentiles is to get rid of religion altogether and to say that we're all, on the side of the proletariat against those awful bourgeoisie. And the same thing here. The best way to eliminate, to stop people thinking in terms of these are Christians and we're the Muslim majority is, we're all together against the Zionist enemy or against Western imperialism and so on. The parallels are fascinating. The problem really resides in the fact that Arab intellectuals in the 20th century borrowed very poorly from the stock of European ideologies. They did not go for Lockean liberal democracy. Instead, they went for nationalism and for socialism. In other words, they went for the models that ultimately gave Europe fascism and Nazism on the one hand and communism on the other. And that has been the serious problem. And of course, in the meantime, a Frankenstein was unleashed, this Frankenstein, in the form of the military regimes and ideologies of Baathism and Arabism, monopolized secularism and actually gave it a brutal edge, causing, of course, in classic Hegelian dialectic historical development, causing its opposite to emerge, which is violent Islamism. And the minorities, including Christians, have become kind of caught in the crossfire in the middle. All of which resulted in implicating the Christians en masse as being supporters of the regime, when in fact this is not accurate. All right, let me continue. One fact has become clear. Christians inside Syria, by and large, are not attracted to the anti-regime rebels, mainly because of the undeniable Islamist undercurrent that has increasingly characterized this opposition. So, how we can debate and argue how much they do or don't support the regime, but they certainly are not attracted to the opposition because of this Islamist current. At the same time, many of these Christians cannot bring themselves to side with the regime given its glaring record of black deeds committed against its own people. Syrian Christian public figures in exile tend to be more numerous and prominent in opposition ranks than Christians back home inside Syria. But on the whole, the Syrian opposition in exile, including its Christians, has proven itself to be quite ineffective in calling the shots on the ground back in the war-torn country. Cities like Homs, Aleppo, Qusayr, and others with sizable Christian residents experienced drastic reductions in Christian numbers when the fighting between the armed rebels and the regime forces intensified in and around these contested urban centers. All kinds of reports with conflicting claims have circulated to the effect that on every occasion these Christians had been purposely targeted and religiously cleansed from their places of residence, and that many had been killed or abducted in the process, and so on. Now, there is truth to a good number of these allegations. But in other instances, there has been exaggeration and even fabrication in the inflated claims of atrocities. Most of the hasty Christian departures have been the result of finding themselves suddenly caught in the crossfire between the regime and the rebels, between Sunni and Alawite or /Shiite forces, even between Turks and Kurds in the northeast along the Syrian-Turkish border. This said, documented incidents of premeditated targeting of Christians did occur and continue to be experienced whenever Daesh and the more militant of the Islamist opposition groups like Nusra come in physical contact with Christian communities. While precise figures for Syrian Christians who have left the country or been internally displaced versus those who have stayed in their homes and villages may not be easy to obtain, there is no doubt that Syria's Christians over the past 5 years of civil war ravaging their country have consistently felt unsafe and insecure, and in recurring instances have been the objects of planned violent abuse. The unprecedented historic meeting in February of this year in Havana Airport between Pope Francis and Moscow Patriarch Kirill produced a joint declaration that expressed profound concern by the two religious leaders who had never met their predecessors as leaders of those two churches had never met in history. Expressed concern for the future of Middle Eastern Christians and named the two Orthodox metropolitans from Aleppo, Paul Yazigi and John Ibrahim, kidnapped in April 2013 by Daesh and still missing. Although the torments of Syria's Christians have hardly received the widespread and impactful global reporting they deserve, this unresolved disappearance of these two Syrian prelates figured prominently in the official released statement of the Pope and the Patriarch. In November 2011, Patriarch Kirill visited Syria and Lebanon as part of a routine trip to neighboring Orthodox patriarchates that a newly elected Russian Orthodox Patriarch undertakes. He expressed support for the beleaguered Christians of Syria and the region, and he also met in Lebanon with Patriarch Bashar Arai of the Maronite Church, himself also a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church who meets with Pope Francis on a regular basis. Since then, Patriarch Kirill has received in Moscow a number of church delegations from Syria and has been outspoken about Russia's deep anxiety regarding the miseries inflicted upon these Christians. Russia's military intervention in Syria since September 2015 on the side of the Assad regime has met with heavy criticism from regional Sunni states like Saudi Arabia and Turkey, but there has been less vocal opposition, notably from the United States. Back in late February of this year, after some impressive Moscow-assisted rollbacks of the anti-Assad opposition forces throughout vital parts of the northwest Syria and around Damascus, the Russians floated the idea of a unified future Syria structured internally along federal or confederal lines, not unlike the de facto federal profile of present-day Iraq, or for that matter, the other obvious candidate for a possible federal restructuring, Ukraine. In the Middle East, The real underlying map of the region is one of deep ethno-religious, sectarian, and tribal heterogeneity. Elsewhere in the world, in Europe and North America specifically, the preferred political remedy for mixed or composite, not to mention divided societies, is some form of creative federalism. The problem with the federal concept is that it is completely misunderstood in the Middle East. You say federalism, people will immediately say fragmentation, destruction of the state. When in fact, federalism is keeping a unified state, but reconfiguring it internally in a different way. Again, this is something we can discuss at length. Let me just try to finish here by saying an unavoidable prerequisite would have to entail the elimination of Daesh in those portions of Syria and Iraq where they have ruthlessly entrenched themselves. There exists international as well as regional consensus on accomplishing this so that any emerging Sunni rump entity in eastern Syria or western Iraq would stand a chance of being run by Sunni moderates who embrace hopefully democratic inclusiveness and do not object to local autonomy and decentralization as vital components of the federal route to be followed. Persistent resistance by Saudi Arabia and Turkey to federalist solutions can only mean their desire to continue to dominate and subjugate non-Sunni and non-Muslim and non-Arab, namely Kurdish, communities throughout the region. In a federal context, Syria's Christians and other indigenous Christian communities scattered across the Middle East stand the best chance of receiving the cherished yet elusive protections and freedoms they seek. Perhaps then they could finally begin to transit from centuries of limitude towards the start of a free and dignified existence. Instead of remaining and being looked upon from the outside as mere living relics of a vanishing past, these native Christians would become a pivotal component of a healthy and vibrant regional pluralism. The more ordinary Muslims come into prolonged peaceful contact with free and rooted Christians living in dignity in their ancestral lands, the better it will be for the new Homo Islamicus and for the resulting new Middle East. Thank you.